Finishing up the conversation from last time in terms of the physics of nuclear weapons, talking about the modern weapons that utilize two innovations. One is called boosting, and the other is what's called a thermonuclear device, a two-stage weapon. Once the original scientific demonstrations have been done of the fission-type devices, which are weaponizable, but barely. These were devices that you see that weighed close to 5 tons and required a very large bomber to transport them there. And then, of course, once the kind of the political wrangling came to an end with the U.S. decision to pursue Teller's dream of the super, then there was an imperative to get on with making these things practical, which meant making them as light as possible with as large as yield as possible, so optimizing yield to weight. And the U.S. testing program got off to a robust start. There were lots of tests. We'll talk about the history of the testing later on in the South Pacific, looking at the effect on surface fleets, both from below the water and atmospheric bursts. We did tests of all sorts. And then we got into the business of pursuing Teller's dream of a two-stage weapon, thermonuclear weapon, which we'll talk about here. The two concepts, one is called boosting. Instead of using very macroscopic amounts of uranium or plutonium in the tens of kilograms, the idea of lightening the device was to make, and here I have to be careful not to get terribly anatomical, but a much thinner shell of fissionable material to implode it, but then to ignite a very small amount of deuterium-tritium gas to produce 14 MeV neutrons. And if you can create a source of 14 MeV neutrons that flow outwards, pelting the fuel on its way in, you can get a much higher efficiency of burnup than you saw, for example, with the little boy design there. I'm going to show some animations that Lee has done for us. I have not modified them in any way because they've already been blessed for consumption on university campuses. And then we're going to show how that is used as the primary in order to create a flow of X-rays, which then drives the implosion of a secondary. So here we go. I'm going to have to pop out of here and now go to the other slide deck, which is the called the addendum here. No. Yes, there we go. Just a few graphs that Lee showed. That will be okay. So you might say, even thinking back to Little Boy and Fat Man, what gave the first neutron on cue? How did we slam this assembly together, either in a gun geometry or an implosion? And we want that first neutron. We actually want a bunch of neutrons, such that in Poisson statistics, you know that you're going to have at least several fissions to begin on cue right at that very millisecond that you want it. And here, this is a reaction you have seen. We did some examples here. We put an alpha emitter, in this case polonium. We put a beryllium ball and shell. And then we shock it, and what happens is we mix the two together, and you get an alpha particle coming off, which is a helium-4 nucleus, plus the beryllium-9, giving rise to a neutron plus carbon-12. And it's a fast neutron. It's a very exothermic reaction, and it's got a good cross-section, precisely because carbon-12 has a It's very strongly bound, and therefore this reaction is going to go like gangbusters. You've got a half of iron cross-section there. Now, it's a low efficiency device, but that doesn't matter. The alpha particle only goes a very short distance into this compressed matter. Once you smush these things together and you bring the beryllium into intimate contact with the polonium, and then one alpha particle finds the beryllium, and you get the neutron out there. All you need is just a handful of neutrons to get the game going, and that's just fine. And so this is a very small initiator. You saw it in the pictures of what was that I showed you of the thing that was called the demon core. Boosting utilizes the fact, and in fact, just the last hour, several of you were in the Masters of Engineering class where we're contemplating the virtues of a DT generator for making neutrons, for making medical isotopes. You see, the reason I'm going to show you both of these for historical importance is you'll see here in a minute. The cross-section for deuterium-tritium fusion is sort of 2 orders of magnitude higher than the DD, and you get a much higher energy neutron out. This is a 14 MeV neutron. This is just a 2.5 MeV neutron, like that. And so the idea here is at the appropriate time, and you see that's a very, very large cross-section. To get this thing going, by the way, the other point of this graph is that you have to get the temperature of this gas mixture up to some tens of keV before you can ignite the gas. And so here I'm combining these two thoughts. One is the compression to crush the initiator and get the alpha particle going, which gets your neutron going, and also the issue of there's your chemical He, and then at the appropriate moment, you squirt in a little bit of deuterium-tritium gas, and away you go. Once you have the primary going, you can use the energy from the primary to ignite the secondary. And you get a much larger yield out. This is called a 2-stage device. And again, I'm not being terribly anatomical about the physics of, although I think this is not terrible, it's not unknown. People are still very skittish to talk about it, about the exact mechanism for how the primary is used to crush the secondary. Now, popularly, people say that the primary is a fission device, the secondary is a fusion device. In fact, it's more nuanced than that. You already see that the primary uses a little bit of DT gas simply to make it more efficient. So the primary already is fission plus fusion. The secondary, the yield of the secondary, is also fusion plus fission. We'll talk a little bit about lithium deuteride in a minute when we talk about the history of the first thermonuclear devices. So here Lee makes the point that, in fact, it's not as simple as saying the primary is fission and the secondary is fusion. Then you go off, you get the rocket effect there, you get the boost from fusion, and then this now compresses the secondary. You need a lot more oomph to get adequate compression of a macroscopic, a lot of DT fuel, and then the neutrons that come out are usually used. You usually use a uranium tamper, and which then gets pelted by this flux of neutrons that come out. And a lot of the yield of the secondary comes out of fission from the tamper of the secondary. And believe me, at 14 MeV, even uranium-238 fissions with unit probability. So in fact, you don't necessarily need to use 235 in the secondary. Anyway, there we have it. Let's go back here, and I want to show you about 2 very historic tests. And I think this is important to show you because, in fact, I've always tried to impress on my students that you are standing on hallowed ground. Berkeley plays an incredibly important role in the history of nuclear weapons, even after the Manhattan Project. The first thermonuclear device ever was called the Ivy Mike shot. It took place November 1st, 1952. They did it way down in the South Pacific. And it was a scientific test. It was something that was absolutely impractical as a weapon. And you'll see why. We'll show just a few minutes of this YouTube here. It was what was called a wet bomb. So the simplest thing to do, it was very difficult to make kilograms and kilograms and kilograms of tritium. The national inventory now is still a very small amount. It's very difficult to make tritium. It decays. It's a very precious commodity. They used for the secondary a pure deuterium, liquid deuterium mass. And as a consequence, this is a science experiment. It required this massive cryogenic refrigerator there. It's not something that weighed, many tens of tons. It was just impossible to weaponize. But you'll actually see this, and you'll actually see why this is historical from a Berkeley point of view. If you get the lights in the back there. Oh, start this again here.
Superchilled liquid deuterium, the hydrogen fuel, as well as raw uranium, tritium,
there's the secondary.
lead baffles, gold leaf reflectors, an ablated polyethylene lining, and sitting at the very top of the assembly, a Nagasaki-style fission bomb to get it on the go. The mechanism, along with its support and refrigeration gear, required a hangar-sized building called a shop tower to house it. The pipes leading up to the right were for observation purposes. They would carry the initial round light down a 2-mile loop tunnel to sensors on the neighboring island. Even as the tunnel was being vaporized.
Those are the diagnostic tunnels.
Welcome aboard the USS. You have a grandstand seat here for one of the most momentous events in the history of science.
Edward R. Murrow?
In less than a minute, you will see the
not
most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. And the blast will come out of the horizon just about there. And this is the significance of the moment. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you'll join me in wishing this expedition well. It is now 30 seconds to 0 time.
Hold on a second. That's my, sorry about that. That's Venetian classical radio. We'll get rid of this. Hold on.
I thought that was his background.
Yeah. Well, it is background music, but I don't want the background music. That's the, how do we get rid of this thing? Sorry about this. Not appropriate. Here we go. Okay, back to the show. Okay. Where did you go? Yes. Okay.
I-8 was a monster, a 2-story, 82-ton stainless cylinder containing a concentric series of furnace funnels, which housed the superchilled liquid deuterium, the hydrogen fuel, as well as raw uranium, tritium, tungsten plutonium spark plug, lead baffles, gold leaf reflectors.
So see, the X-rays, the atoms, and neutrons were going down there. The diagnostics were there, and all they would be consumed by the fireball. They were able to get the signals out and do scientific recordings on the explosion.
Required a hangar-sized building called a shop tower to house it. The pipes leading up to the right were for observation purposes. They would carry the initial round light down a 2-mile loop tunnel to sensors on the neighboring island. Even as the tunnel was being vaporized by the blast.
Welcome aboard the USS. You have a grandstand seat here for one of the most momentous events in the history of horizon just about there. And this is the significance of the moment. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you join me in wishing this expedition well. It is now 30 seconds to zero time. The goggles are turned away. The critical goggles are placed first until 10 seconds after the first line.
The only thing missing was the inventor. Despite having been passed over for the directorship of the project, Dr. Teller had gone over to Berkeley, and it was on his team to prepare the test shot without his help.
I could not go. I had to stay there. But I had the seismograph set up and all seismologists in Berkeley watching. The guys at Los Alamos thought the Teller walked out on hydrogen work because he thought that they were going to screw it up. He didn't want to have his name on it. But the fact that he was waiting at the basement in Berkeley for the seismic yield measurements come through indicates that by then he knew it would probably work.
At 7:15 a.m. local time, a radio signal from the control room on board the cruiser Estes ordered the capacitors of the fission primary to simultaneously discharge into 92 designates. The resulting shock waves raced through the high explosive shell, converging on and compressing the plutonium sphere into a supercritical metallic fluid, and crushing the tiny initiator in its core, releasing a few dozen neutrons to start the chain reaction. Million-degree X-rays outran the blast wave by milliseconds, racing down the radiation channels to immolate the interior plastic line and send it crashing inward toward the plutonium spark plug suspended within the now superheating liquid deuterium.
Deuterium, but that's fissionable, that's uranium now.
Reaction of tritium at its core.
You gotta get that going by combustion.
Shockwave that inward Russian radiation further compressed the deuterium. Hydrogen atoms began to fuse, momentarily creating every element that ever existed in the universe, and come forth the sides. A few millions of a second after receiving its orders from the Estes, life burst free of its thermostat and was heading for the outer stratosphere.
They were stuck by the size of the pond. By the time we got out into the upper stratosphere, it spread out across 30 miles. So they watched this thing coming closer and closer. They were 30 miles out. Suddenly, it's flat right over their heads. And that was shocking to them.
As the second sunrise rose over Iata, Halloween was in full swing back in California. Ghosts and goblins roamed the Berkeley streets and her tower sat in the dark, eyes fixed on the size of the rapids.
And decided at the time that the something should arrive, and not arrive. And that time I knew it was success. And he ran the clean up of the people in Los Alamos. We don't go there.
It would be many hours before news from the South Pacific would make it through secure channels to Los Alamos. Teller immediately sent his old lab a telegram reading, "It's a boy."
See, the thing that you have probably figured out about Dr. Teller is that he never seemed to miss an opportunity to kind of pick a fight with somebody. He sort of got a little bit pitched out during the Manhattan Project, and again, even this project, which is brainchild, he seems to have gotten cross-threaded with the Los Alamos team, came to Berkeley, and in fact, I will give a popsicle to anybody who finds out which building on the Berkeley campus. Well, there was, I haven't actually been able to find this out, maybe you know, Michael, which building on the Berkeley campus actually had the seismograph that he went down to. He was actually on the Berkeley campus. He was the first person in the world outside of the team in the South Pacific that knew the thing was a success. He knew it would take 20 minutes for the seismic wave to cross the Earth from the Bikini Atoll to California. He saw it and knew it was a success. hours before the team in Los Alamos knew, and he sort of teased them with this message, you know, it's a boy. Here's the other thing. The next shot we did was called Castle Bravo, and this was Professor Bernstein, Lee Bernstein, talks about the importance of nuclear data. This was the first dry bomb. A dry bomb is, look, we can't schlep around all this cryogenic deuterium. We need a more practical way of carrying fusion elements. And by the way, if we can we get a DT device and not a DB device, which is a lower cross section and lower energy Q value. And so what they did here was they actually used lithium deuteride, and they used enriched. Or capital D. So this is nice. Natural uranium contains in the Earth's crust, or natural lithium, is 5% lithium-6 and 95% lithium-7. And just as you can, if you do enrichment of 238 over 235, where the mass difference is very small, it's child's play to enrich lithium to get the 5% up to something much more. So in the Castle Bravo shot, you had important number, you actually had 40% lithium-6 and 60% lithium-7. Now, everyone said the key thing is the lithium-6 because what you're looking for is the reaction lithium-6 that produces an alpha particle, or helium-4 nucleus, plus a tritium. And so once the reaction gets going, you get some neutrons hitting the lithium, you crack you get lithium-7 falling apart into an alpha particle of tritium. You make the tritium on the fly. You make it as you use it, and then you have, there's your deuterium, you have the D plus K giving you the 14 MeV neutron plus an alpha particle, helium-4 nucleus. Okay, plus a huge Q value. Q value is 17.6 MeV. Now, there was a very bad surprise. The bomb ran away on it. They were expecting, they designed it for a 6 megaton yield, and it yielded 15. Big problem. They actually did this shot when the wind conditions were not quite right. They were not terribly worried about where the fallout was going to go. The scientists were at an inward observation point that put them at risk. When this thing went off, they realized they had to get those guys out of there in a hurry. They actually had to shelter in place until the cloud went elsewhere. But this thing really was a bad actor. The plume went hundreds of miles. It caused a big problem for the Marshall Island natives. They actually were evacuated for many years. DOE is still studying the effects of the fallout on the Marshall Islands. And there was a Japanese fishing boat that no one knew was there. They thought they had cleared the area. And the fallout went right on them. All, I think it was 13 or 19 or so fishermen got very sick and one died. And of course, this was a big public relations event with Japan. They did not like this at all. Now, what happened? Why did the thing run away? This is what shows you they did not know enough about the nuclear physics. Once you started getting very high energy neutrons, they thought, by the way, that the lithium-6 was the only thing that mattered. Once you start getting very high energies melting the lithium-7, you can get the reaction. What happens? You've just multiplied your tritium fuel by 2.5. It's not just the lithium-6 that's making the tritium. You're getting tritium from lithium-7. And lo and behold, the ratio, 100% to 40% is exactly the ratio of the 15 megatons to the 6 megatons. And this was a big issue. Anyway, one more thing, and as I say, I show these things because I think people should understand the Berkeley history. A guy who played a very important role here, I think Professor Knock, you probably know, that is Mark Mills. He was trained, born in Estes Park, Colorado, 1917, trained in Aeroastro. He, at some point in the 1950s, got interested in nuclear power. He was a consultant at the camp. He's an adjunct faculty. He was a adjunct professor and then became a full professor here. He is the person that set up the nuclear engineering program here at Berkeley. When you actually see histories of the nuclear engineering department, of which I was the 10th chair, some people count him as the first chair, others, I think it was Tom Pickford. At that time, it was called the Nuclear Engineering Division of UC Berkeley. Wow, people had great expectations when they talked about nuclear engineering as a division. Anyway, he went and then became deputy director of Lawrence Livermore and was heavily involved in the test program. He died in a helicopter crash, actually, as part of the preparations for a test sequence down there. So he was right there in that Iata atoll. So his plane went, his helicopter went down in a torrential rainstorm. I'm going to have, I think, at some later point, we may have Charles Vigorani come in. She'll actually give you the rundown on the U.S. stockpile today, and I'll turn it over to Professor Knock. But I thought it would be interesting that you know a little bit about Berkeley's history and role of all this. So someone please find out what building the seismograph was in.
Was it in the Shires?
No.
Isn't that where there's something else?
That's the Berkeley Geochronology Center. They've been there for 25 years.
We don't know anything about it quite somewhere.
Yeah. That building doesn't belong to us. It's actually the Anglican Theological Seminary. But okay, do we rent it?
In the video of the wet device, they showed the initiator being something like the urgent initiator using the first bombs. Were they really using internal initiation that late?
I don't know. And as I say, beyond a certain point, I don't want to become too anatomical anyway.
Understood.
So this was still very early. This was still 52.
You talk about not wanting to get too anatomical, and you said Lee made these slides. Do you believe within the weapons program?
That's a broad term. Lee and I have always been in the, for 25 years, in the physics end of things, where it provides basic physics knowledge and data and technology to the program. The people who work in the core program, Lee has much more of an intimate connection with them than I did. But we still consult with them, as does Professor Knock.
Anything else?
Here we go.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears. From everything we've discussed so far, you would think that this whole nuclear is just a two-player game, the United States and the Soviet Union that became Russia. But of course, it is a two-player game. It's a multiplayer game. In fact, it was important stuff going on right now, if you followed it, with the exchange of armed conflict between India and Pakistan right now, which is quite important. I'll maybe get to that. There's another session on proliferation scheduled later in the semester, so I'll do what I can to get us through a bunch of stuff today. Let's begin. You have the, okay. So, one issue that came up right away is, how do you define a nuclear weapon state? And the answer was Do you know what the answer was? This is in the 1940s.
How do you define a what?
A nuclear weapon state. What is a nuclear weapon? It's a state that detonates a nuclear weapon.
One time.
If it detonates one weapon, it's a weapon state. So of course the US had detonated in 1945. There's the Alamogordo test, then over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the Soviets in 1949. At the time when there was this big fight in the US about whether to proceed with thermonuclear weapons. Now the British, because we know from our early discussions, they were pioneers in atomic physics. They were actually ahead of the United States in understanding the weaponization of atomic physics. They participated fully in the Manhattan Project. They were our closest ally during the Second World War. Roosevelt and Churchill were very close. And after the war, Britain, which began to lose its colonial empire, very much wanted nuclear weapons of its own in order to retain great power status, in order to possibly, if necessary, deter a Soviet nuclear attack on Britain, and to be part of the big club in the post-war world, wherever that was going, who knew? Politically in the United States, there was not a lot of support for the US to collaborate with Britain on nuclear weapons, even though we had been so close. We didn't want to be a spreader of these technologies. And it was passed the McMahon Act. Do we have a...
Right here, pointer?
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
The McMahon Act, Atomic Energy Act of 1946, controlled and restricted data that precluded the U.S. sharing data with its allies. I would say probably there's a decent chance Roosevelt had lived and Roosevelt was still president at this time. It might not have happened because Roosevelt was such an admirer of Churchill and what the British had done to survive the Nazi attacks and then to win the war. I think that Roosevelt might have persuaded others to provide them with the material. But he died in April '45 and Truman was president. Truman had no particular connections with the British. He was a failed haberdasher from Kansas City. He had a hat store that had gone under and then got into politics and became a senator from Missouri and then vice president and then lo and behold became president. He did not know of the existence of the atomic bomb when he was vice president. He only learned about it after Roosevelt died. And he's a very practical, pragmatic guy. You know, Missouri is the show-me state, very practical. So he said, yeah, we don't want anybody else to have this stuff. So he supported the precluding Britain from acquiring these weapons. The debate still went on, and the British made some pact with the Canadians, who also have been involved in the Manhattan Project, to try to develop a program of their own. But then Anglo-US relations suffered a big setback because there were a series of British citizens, Alan May, Klaus Fuchs, and Donald McLean, all of whom were arrested and convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. So even though the Soviets had detonated in '49, we certainly didn't want to be sort of partnering with a country that was so leaky that it was providing the Russians additional information. So that was very damaging to the British situation. I think, yeah, also it was very strong. You can't underestimate the domestic political support that nuclear weapons brings to a government. People are very proud. Years later, there was a comment by a famous Pakistani. This was after the after the Indians and the Israelis. I'm getting ahead of myself, I bombs up. And he said, look, he said, the Christians have the bomb. This thought in religious terms. The Hindus have the bomb. The Jews have the bomb. Why can't the Muslims have the bomb? And this is irrelevant right this afternoon, what's going on in Pakistan. It's not working.
I think you might want.
It's this button right here, top one, just under the screen. Yeah. See it?
No.
You just made it work.
No.
No, you're wrong button, this button. See, if you feel a little pressure.
That's no, that's this one. I wanted the slides to move.
Oh, slides? Oh, I thought you wanted the laser pointer. Sorry.
Okay, so Britain started its own program. They had a bunch of very high-powered, knowledgeable scientists and engineers from their own efforts and from the Manhattan Project. And ultimately, they tested in Australia in 1952. And by this time, I don't know if you may not know the political history, but quickly, Churchill, who was, of course, the great hero of the Second World War, was defeated for re-election in 1945 because the British people said, we need a crazy right-wing nut in a war with the fascists, but we don't want it in peacetime. We just want milk and bread, get back to normal. So Churchill was out of the picture from the mid to late 40s into the early 50s when he then got reelected. And he learned that Britain was in fact still getting ready for its own nuclear bomb program, its own tests. And they tested in 52 and tested their first hydrogen bomb in 57. Very quickly, and they've had nuclear weapons ever since. So they are the third nuclear weapon state. US, Soviet Union / Russia, Great Britain. And today, I didn't have all of the history of the program, so just skipping ahead, it's gone through a lot of an evolutionary phase. They have 4 submarines based in Scotland. This is also important because there's been a Scottish independence movement. And questions about, where would they base their weapons if Scotland actually separated from England? But that sort of died down. They have several referendums and they have laws. And they each carry American-made Trident II missiles. And they have a stockpile of 200 some odd weapons, 120 of which can fly into continental ranges. The equivalent of the Lawrence Livermore Lab, Los Alamos complex for Britain is at Aldermaston in southeast England, AWE. Carl, you been to AWE?
No.
No. So it's quite an interesting place. One thing when you travel around to other countries in the nuclear business, if you're familiar with Livermore and Los Alamos, you realize how tiny the other activities are compared to the US. For every 2 people Aldermaston has, the US might have 300 working on the same subject. There are, though, current close ties. In fact, not that long ago, the president of Sandia National Labs, whose name escapes me now, he had been the head of the second in command at AWE. He spent 3 years at AWE. There's a lot of interaction. But as if you read, have you had a chance to read the Narang book at all? It's this book. You may not be familiar with it. This is the book required for the section on proliferation. And narrating, by the way, was an Indian American, very smart young man, studied at Stanford, got a PhD in political science, did a dissertation really on this subject, the nuclear strategy of middle powers. And now he's an associate, got tenure as associate professor of political science at MIT. And this is the book from his dissertation. And in the very early part of the book, he writes that I, Vikram Narayan, do not consider Britain as part of the proliferation chain because they're not really independent, they're so closely tied to the United States. That's also controversial. I think Britain would disagree with that. I think many students of nuclear proliferation would disagree with that. He does cite that there's dual key control of tactical nuclear forces, that the British lease some forces from the US, that there's coordination, strategic targeting. So it's such an intimate relationship. Narayan felt this is really not a totally separate activity. So that's our site there, omitted by Narayan because not considered independent. France. So France became the fourth country to detonate a nuclear weapon and to become an independent nuclear power. They did it in 1960. There's a history here. The French, of course, are allied with the US during the Second World War. Many French were very beholden to the Americans for the Normandy invasion and the freedom of the French from the Nazis. But after the war, the French went their own way. French, anybody from France here? No. French have a very independent spirit and never wanted to be excessively beholden to the United States. Their colonial empire began to disappear also, as did the British after the Second World War. They had major colonial territories in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were all part of French colonial territory. And then they started a communist revolution to throw the French out. And the French alone fought them in the early 50s. And at one point, there was a very critical battle, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. How many of you have heard of Dien Bien Phu? Doesn't register anymore. Okay. So Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the Prime Minister of France was a man named Pierre Mendès France. That was his full name, Pierre Mendès France. And there were French forces surrounded by the Viet Minh, who were the North Vietnamese communist forces in Vietnam. And Mendès France requested of Eisenhower, who had replaced Truman as president, he requested of Eisenhower that the US use nuclear weapons on the Viet Minh to save the French forces. And Eisenhower said no. He said nuclear weapons should only, like Truman said, they should only be used as a strategic weapon if your own homeland is threatened. Vietnam is your problem. It's not for us to deal with. The French, of course, were furious beyond belief. This alienated a lot of French elite opinion toward the United States. Oh, and of course, Dien Bien Phu fell. The French lost the battle, and then they left Vietnam to be replaced by the Americans, who fought there for 15 years and lost about 58,000 Americans were killed. And by the way, our president, all of our presidents, is there tonight in Hanoi, in North Vietnam, Northern Vietnam, negotiating with Kim Dae-jung about North Korea. And he has said, if you follow this, He said that Vietnam had been a big enemy of ours and now has become a hugely prosperous economic power while still a one government communist state, and they should be the model for North Korea. So Trump is dangling the Vietnamese model as a future for North Korea if they would give up their nuclear weapons. Vietnam doesn't have nuclear weapons. But this failure of the U.S. to support the French at Dien Bien Phu was crucially important in building distrust among the French about the Americans. And in '58, a few years later, Charles de Gaulle, the hero of the Free French during the Second World War, became the president of France. And he ordered a quick acceleration of the French nuclear program. The French have always thought of themselves as a great nation, great culture, great food, great women, everything's great about the French. And they also were concerned in the 50s about deterring Soviet attack. So a quick anecdote, the sort of intellectual father of the French nuclear program was an army general named Pierre Gallois. And in the 70s, it's years later, I had an opportunity to be in France and contacted Gallois to talk to him about these issues. And he said, well, I am actually busy. I won't be in the office, but you come to my home for dinner. So how many of you have been to France? So you know it's a fabulous place. Paris is an amazing city. And he lived in a palatial apartment on the right bank of Paris, the ritziest area. I was by myself in my, been in my early 30s then. And I went to his home. And the servant answered the door. It was very upscale. And the dinner was General Gallois, Madame Gallois, and Monsieur Naft at a very long table, like 4 times the size of this table. Gallois was at one end, Madame Gallois was at the other end, and I was in the middle. I don't remember what we had, but I remember the food was fantastic. I felt like a dog. The food was just off the charts. Then, you know, I wasn't controlling anything about it. I had some questions to ask him, but toward the end of the serving of the food, the general looks down at the table at his wife and goes like this. That meant dismissed. She got up, said good night, she left. He said, we will go into the drawing room for cigars and brandy. So we went into like a study room filled with beautiful books, and he had fancy cigars and brandy. And the summary, the key point was, he said to me, Monsieur Naft, he said, you must understand one thing about we French. We have fought many times. We have fought against the Germans in the 1870s. We have fought in World War I against the Germans. We have fought in World War II against the Germans. We have fought in Vietnam against the communists. We have fought in Algeria against the independence movement. We have always, always lost. That's why we need nuclear weapons. We can never afford to lose again. I mean, I felt like I was sort of in the presence of God. I mean, he was just such a powerful personality, a great French patriot. And so he was a key figure. I don't know what the analogy would be, because he was a military man, sort of a combination of General Groves with a little Oppenheimer thrown in. He was technically quite smart, but he was more politically and strategically influential. So they detonated their first device in 1960. That's now 15 years after Pearl Harbor, after Hiroshima. It was called Blue Desert Rat, 70 kilotons in the Sahara Desert. Sahara, because that was Algeria, and that was still French territory. French North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, were all French colonies. And they developed what became known as the Force de Frappe, or strike force, which originally had the three legs of the U.S. trident, had air, sea, and land-based systems. Their emphasis, for the most part, was on counter-value targeting, hitting cities. They claimed their main approach, if credible, would just be to be able to destroy major population centers in the Soviet Union, and that would be a credible deterrent against the Soviet attack. They estimated that they could strike after an initial attack by the Soviets and kill 80 million Russians. It should be more than enough to deter them from attacking. I don't know, I've never looked at the assumptions behind those calculations. The Soviets would, if they attacked, would obviously have a comprehensive counter-force attack to destroy as many of these weapons as possible. So I don't know how much the French took that into account. Now they have a whole bunch of these warheads. They've got 4 submarines. They've got Mirage aircraft. And they built a big stockpile. Their main Los Alamos, a little more equivalent, is Saclay, which is south of Paris. Have you been there?
No.
So I made it there. So invited to speak there, and very impressive. Very, very smart people, very smart, and state-of-the-art knowledge on these issues, both technically and strategically. And it remains, there's never been an I should have mentioned, in Britain, there's always been an anti-nuclear movement. And Aldermaston, equivalent of Los Alamos, there are always people demonstrating against nuclear weapons. There's no anti-nuclear movement in France, there's never been. Left to right, they buy into the need of nuclear weapons for deterrence and for greatness. Any questions about this so far? I'm going sequentially about the spread of nuclear weapons. Yeah, yes? Then finally, this is the last of the original 5 nuclear weapon states. We come to the Chinese. China became an independent communist state in 1949, Mao's victory. The first time in Chinese history, virtually, that all of China was united under one rule. It was a phenomenal accomplishment by Mao Zedong. And they were initially a small kid brother of the Soviets in the communist movement. There was tension right away because Stalin died in 1953. And when he died, Mao said, I am now the senior communist leader in the world, not you, who was then some combination of Malenkov and Khrushchev, people we talked about in the film, The Death of Stalin. The Soviets said, no. We're number one. So there was a tension in Soviet-Chinese relations really since the death of Stalin in 1953. But they were still buddies, they were still allies through the 50s. And they supplied important assistance to the Chinese for their own nuclear weapons program. Dubna, which is their main Los Alamos, was the host for many Chinese scientists and engineers to learn about nuclear weapons. The Soviets never provided the Chinese with the same quality and quantity of systems that they themselves had. and the Chinese knew that. Never frontline systems. But enough to do the job. And eventually, in 1964, the Chinese tested. So they're the 5th nuclear weapon state. So that's US 45, Soviet Union 49, Britain 52, France 60, China 64. They're the 5 original nuclear weapon states. And today, estimated that they have 250, 260 warheads, multiple based, land, sea, and air. Their land-based systems are based on mobile missiles that move around, so they're harder to target, and in ICBMs that are underground. And China definitely has ICBMs with nuclear warheads that can hit the continent of the United States, and hit all parts of it. But the United States has never acknowledged that our relationship with China is a relationship of mutual assured destruction, which we have acknowledged with with Russia. And the Chinese have never wanted to be engaged in arms control, except because we're little guys, we have so few weapons compared to what you and the Russians have. So they're the 5th state. Any questions about what we have so far?
I'd like to just ask you a question. I was unaware, and I was quite stunned by how disproportionate the French stockpile is. That's expensive.
Yeah.
Actually, as we know, to maintain that. Why
Right.
didn't they at some point build up? Or why did they build up to such large numbers?
I think they just, there's an inherent lack of trust of the United States.
Well,
And wanting to be independent. So I mentioned that the size of the Chinese stockpile is itself quite uncertain. The 260 number is an estimate. Countries say things and write things about their nuclear strategy. And what they say and what they write is called declaratory policy. And the Chinese declaratory policy is different from all the others in that they pledge no first use of nuclear weapons. We will not be the first to use them. There was a very brief period after the Soviet Union collapse where Russia also adopted a no first use policy, but they've since discarded it. They have a huge test site at Lac Nord in Xinjiang, China. There are Chinese here, aren't there? Anyone from China here? How many of you have been to China? Have any of you been to Xinjiang? Xinjiang is the westernmost province of China, and it's where the Muslims are, the Uyghurs, who've been very critical of the Han Chinese government. They want to be sort of have a local autonomy. They don't want to be an independent country. They want to have local autonomy in the governance of their affairs. And there's definitely trouble there, but there are no Western journalists allowed in. So no one really knows exactly what's going on. I had an opportunity, totally different, seemingly unrelated, I didn't even know this would happen, to go to Kyrgyzstan. Did I mention this in the class previously?
no.
So I don't know if you're familiar with, there are 5 states of only Soviet Central Asia. You can picture, the Soviet Union, Russia's 11 time zones long. So this is in the southern part. They are Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and
Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan. Is there somebody here from Uzbekistan?
Kazakhstan.
You're from Kazakhstan. So there was a man who was the chief scientist to Gorbachev, his name was Roel Sagdeev, Sagdeev, and he became a critic of the Soviet Union before it collapsed. And he was married with 3 kids, but became romantically involved with Susan Eisenhower, General Eisenhower's granddaughter. And he defected to the United States and became a professor of physics at the University of Maryland, where I was dean of the public policy school. I met him. And actually had him and his wife be the commencement speaker one year for our class, Détente, the future. Anyway, years later, in the late 90s, Sagdeev said to me, I'd like to take you to Kyrgyzstan. I didn't even know how to spell it. Ah, good. Thank you, Mensa. It was great. So Kyrgyzstan is here. It's a small, landlocked country. It has few resources. Bishkek is the capital. And it was relatively peaceful at the time. There was a major war going on in Tajikistan. And Sagdeev had been asked to mediate the fighting in Tajikistan. He says, you know something about arms control, why don't you come along, maybe you can help me. So I was stupid enough to say yes. And I told my wife I was going to Kyrgyzstan. She said, no, you're not. I knew nothing about it. I really didn't. There isn't a single question you could ask me about Kyrgyzstan that I knew the answer to. Even how to spell it. I knew nothing.
What year did you go?
So this was 1997. So he said, oh, by the way, he said, I have to go to Kyrgyzstan. I have to go to Bishkek earlier to meet with the president. So I can't go with you. You'll have to go yourself. I said, okay, just tell me who to call to get tickets and we'll work it out. So the trip, well, I was living in D.C. at the time, Washington, D.C. The flight was from Dulles Airport in Washington to Frankfurt on Lufthansa Airlines, and then Lufthansa from Frankfurt to Almaty, the former capital of Kazakhstan. And then Sagdeev said that we'd be greeted by a driver, and he would drive us from, where's Kazakhstan?
Up to right here.
Here, from Almaty to Bishkek. So I took those flights. I got off the plane. There were almost no Caucasians on the plane. And you know, when you get off the plane, people have signs. So I saw a sign that said something like N-A-T-C-H-E-T in English.
Huh.
I said, that has to be me. Oh, there's nobody on the plane named matches. So I said, you live in Michael Knock? He said, yes. I said, oh, so now we get in a car and drive to Bishkek? And the woman said, drive to Bishkek now? No. Bandits. Bandits. Very dangerous. This was midnight. She was head of the English department at the University of Kazakhstan. She said, we'll take you to a small hotel that was built by Lufthansa. Kazakhstan is a very active place because of all the oil. It's an international area. And you'll get at 5 in the morning, and we'll have a car and driver, and they'll drive you from Almaty to Bishkek. But one thing, she said, the driver only speaks Russian and Kazakh. So if you have any questions, ask them now. She won't be able to say anything. And it's a 5-hour drive. I said, no, just get me to sleep and keep me safe. That's all. So I went into the hotel. I got at 5 in the morning, went downstairs, met the driver. And we got in the car, and the driver had in the front seat, the driver was the driver, and the front seat next to him was a little boy, like 10 years old, who was his son. He was going on the trip, and I was in the back seat below. That was it. The driver, his son, and Michael Knight. And for an hour, it was pitch black, silence, not a word was said. And then suddenly the little boy turns around. He's got in his hand a stack of audio tapes. And he said to me in quite good English, "Would you like to hear Barbra Streisand or the Three Tenors?" So I said, "This is American music imperialism has come to Kazakhstan." I said, "Well, listen to all of them." We listened to every tape we had. And we made this trip, and it's a beautiful drive. It's like, and this was where Genghis Khan had been.
Mm-hmm.
Mountainous, little like Aspen, Colorado, not quite as beautiful. Lovely, lovely spot. And we got to Bishkek, and Bishkek is half Russian speaking and half Kyrgyz, very close to the Russians. And we went into a hotel, and there was a room where the delegates were to try to resolve this conflict. And the Tajiks who were in the room had AK-47 rifles on the table next to me. I didn't have any AK-47. Well, I mention this because right here is China. And right around here is Lac Nord. The Chinese main nuclear test facility, like 80 miles or 50 miles east of the Kyrgyz border. And there are tons of people in Bishkek who know a lot about what's going on in Lac Nord. So I spent some time in Bishkek talking about Chinese nuclear forces, which I never would expect, because my whole mindset was I'm in Soviet Central Asia, a million miles from China, but no, I was right next door to China. Kazakhstan now, of course, has a separate capital. Where's the capital? It's north. It's Astana, right? You from Astana? So, a little bit about Lac Nord. And of course, in that western part, that's where the Uyghurs are. That's where the trouble is. And I'd say, you know, why do they want nuclear weapons? They want it to be a great power. They want to deter a U.S. nuclear attack. And then as things were getting worse, they wanted to deter a possible Soviet nuclear attack. And they fought a war. There was a Soviet-Chinese border clash in 1969 on the Ussuri and Amur rivers. And you have that. You put that. You have that on a map. Ussuri and Amur rivers, Soviet-Chinese border. Maybe not. Did I mention this to you about the SALT I negotiations in this? No. When the U.S. began negotiations on the strategic arms limitation talks in 1969, the head of the delegation was a man named Gerard Smith. He was a very wealthy man, the largest single owner of General Motors stock in the world. Very wealthy. And there was a break in the action during one of the negotiating sessions. And the Soviet head of delegation named Semyonov said to Smith, "I need to speak to you privately." This was while the border conflict was going on. And he said, "Would you like to join us in a nuclear attack on China?" Smith practically had a stroke. So he cabled back to Kissinger saying the Soviet head of delegation has just said that they want us to collaborate in attacking China with nuclear weapons. What do I do? And Kissinger said, say and do nothing. Ignore it. Assume you never said it. They'll realize the answer is no, but you're not going to say no. So that's what happened. And there was a serious conflict, border conflict between the Chinese and the Russians at that time. Okay, let's go back. So you now had 5 states, and of course another thing was that there were all the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Right, the UN Security Council has 5 member states: U.S., Soviet Union, now Russia, Britain, France, and China. China was originally Taiwan of the Security Council. But in 1971, when Nixon went to China, part of the deal was that we withdrew our recognition of Taiwan. We had this sort of informal arrangement with Taiwan, but we recognize that there's only one China and it's based in Beijing. So now you have 5 nuclear weapon states, and it's almost 20 years after the Second World War. So there became quite a lot of concern about this issue, which is now being called nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons. And there's a prominent British writer, C.P. Snow, who's both a chemist and a literary figure, and he predicted that there would be 20 nuclear weapon states by the end of the 60s, and there would be nuclear war if this continued, that this was the most important subject in the world, like what some would say climate change is today. So this ultimately stimulated discussions and then negotiations among three major nuclear weapon states: US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And it led them to develop and sketch out the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. It was signed by all 3 states in '68 and entered into force in 1970. You guys are mostly engineers, so do you know actually how the United States enters into a treaty, how that even works? Some of you may know. I'll give you the short version. A duly authorized representative of the United States must sign the agreement. Now, we've got fishing treaties with Iceland. We've got a zillion different treaties. So it's not always the president. This one was the president. And the treaty is signed, but then the US Senate, not the House, the Senate, considers the ratification of the treaty through the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And 2/3 of the Senate, the Foreign Relations Committee must approve it, and then 2/3 of the Senate must vote in support of ratification of the treaty. So all that took almost 2 years to work out. And the British have their own system. The Soviets had no system. I mean, basically the Soviet president signed it. The parliament just approved it. So by 1970, there was a treaty. It recognized that there were 5 nuclear weapon states, these 5. Everyone else in the world was invited to join as non-nuclear weapon states. Panama, Sri Lanka, Iceland, everyone in the whole world could join as a non-nuclear weapon state. And if they did that, they would gain assistance from a new organization that was set up, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to help them develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. If we can work it out, we've had here for a few years, Carl and I, a wonderful man named George Moore, who worked in the Safeguards Division of the IAEA. He'll tell you a lot about how the IAEA works. It's based in Vienna, Austria. And actually, I just finished a paper with a student, both in nuclear engineering and public policy, and she's working there now. And she works in, Sarah Layton, she works in the Safeguards Division of the IAEA. Wonderful picture. MIT undergrad, very smart, terrific person. There's the IAEA in Vienna created to assist signatories in development of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, plus a separate capability. IAEA has a separate capability to determine that all signatories are abiding by the NPT, and they do that with sophisticated verification techniques. And of course, the IAEA is not the sole verifier of compliance with nuclear weapons. The major countries have their own means. It's called National Technical Means of Verification, NTM. So the US has a very elaborate, sophisticated effort to make sure that other countries are complying with the NPT. Over the years, almost every country in the world signed. There are less than 200 countries in the world, 190 are members of the NPT. Countries, Southeast Asian islands, Pacific Island countries, people in the Caribbean, people who had no interest at all in this stuff signed. It was indicated they were part of the sort of current international framework. 3 countries notably didn't sign: Israel, India, Pakistan. They never signed the treaty. And one of them did sign, North Korea, but then withdrew. And these 4 became the next wave of nuclear weapon states: Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea. Another country has gotten close, but has not gone over the line, but is a part of the treaty, and that's Iran. Although now things are more tricky with Iran since Trump had us withdraw from the joint agreement with Iran on stopping their nuclear weapons. So maybe I'll wait till next time to look at Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, and Iran. Yeah, then I get on to all these other countries. Stuff there. Any questions at all about this? How many of you have this is old hat to most of you? How many of you know all this? Just trying to get a feel. No. It's nice to know if you're going to be nuclear engineers. Nice to know who's got nuclear weapons in the world. Nice to know something about this. Okay? So we'll see you next time.
Each year that passes, a lot of this history that we're up with is just, we see it's further and further, so don't assume.
No,